Minnesota. How's it going, Mike?
Very good. Probably similar to you, my friend, that we're looking at the first few inches of snow in upstate New York.
Yeah, and it's been strange because last week was balmy.
Yeah.
It was warm, and in fact, because of my mother's death, we're backed up on a few things we wanted to do in the garden. Like right before I came in, I was spreading compost in the hoop house because we grow spinach and kale and stuff in the hoop house for winter. And we were going to do it earlier, but it was too warm and it would have bolted.
Yep.
And I also didn't get the garlic in. And after my mother's funeral, I went to Washington, D.C. for a few days. It came back and it was winter again.
Uh-huh.
So,
how much snow do you have? Buffalo has 3 or 4 feet right now, I think.
that's what I heard. Well, not maybe an inch right now.
Okay, we're about an inch or two.
It rains or it snows every day and it kind of melts away.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. But here we go. And it's a magical time of the year, as we know. As the forces of nature draw inward into the earth again. And what better time to talk about fairies? And here we are. Today our guest is James Tunney. James, welcome to the Regeneration Podcast.
It's great to see you, Michael and Mike. And I was thinking about your mother, listening to some of your podcasts. I'm very interested in your work, and in particular because I notice some of the threads emerging in your discourse is very similar.
Yeah, I think so. You're a real fit.
That's how you came to my attention. A friend of mine contacted me, so you gotta check out this guy because I know it now. James, he's not practicing barrister, correct? No longer practicing, but a former lawyer and an academic, right? And you turned, I don't know how many years ago.
I qualified as a barrister. I qualified as a barrister and went on to the master's degree. Then I went into teaching, but I went off to Spain for a few years. But my main career was as a lecturer and a senior lecturer in law. And I worked as an international legal consultant for international bodies as well, and a lot of contracts and in other universities. So that was my main career. And then I decided at the time when we were starting a family that was enough of the academic world, and I was going to paint and write and look after the kids. So
nice.
That's what I've done.
You've been able to pull it off. So many people want to do that, James, but they just don't think they could ever pull it off.
Well, time will tell whether I have done that or not. But
it seems like you've done a great job.
Yeah. Very glad to do that.
Let me ask you, James, when you said, I'm just curious, you said you had listened to some of these podcasts and some themes. I think Michael and I would both be interested to hear from an outsider, like first take, what would you say are some of those themes? I'm not so sure I would even be able to name them so well.
Well, some of I've come to key kind of nodal thinkers in my analysis, and they come up again and they become more important. And it's as we know, it's like a spiral. Sometimes their importance only becomes evident when circumstances change. So, for example, William Blake is an important aspect, and the idea of Jesus' imagination, of course, is a critical one. The idea of what the imagination is. Ivan Illich is one that I've had to look back to recently.
Represent, yeah.
I had to look back to, and sometimes you don't pay attention. You look through and say, okay, and then some bits you begin to see how they join together, particularly in his focus on technology, conviviality, and the relationship as well between the church and the institution and where it may have gone wrong from his perspective. I think it was a profound analysis. I hear in your discussion a discussion about the nature, as a listener, the nature of Catholicism as an undercurrent, and how perhaps religious experience can be revivified, and also that ties in with the connection between, I'm not going to say paganism, but ancient traditions and religious belief. Yeah. And also I get a sense of that you're talking about a lived belief as opposed to something which is doctrinal and stale. So that's, and also an undercurrent of Ian McGilchrist, left brain, right brain, and obviously inherent in that, is a critique of undue left brain, death and ossification and crystallization at the expense of the fluid right brain, and a few other themes like that.
It's like a genius snapshot. I feel totally naked and exposed.
Yeah. Well, it's a compliment. It's a compliment to your range. Also, I was surprised as well to hear Berdyaev and the Russian thinkers mentioned, because when I began to look at my own critique of technology and come back to personalism, I found myself going back to Russia, not in the depth that Michael has gone, but Berdyaev is a kind of hinged thinker, and Dostoevsky in particular at the period in early 1860s is critical, because my critique more and more has come to the idea, and there's probably an eschatological element of your debate as well. I'm trying to locate a changing point, and I'm more and more convinced that there was 2 centuries that were critical. The first one was associated with Swedenborg, which although he posited the date of 1757. If we take the 7 Years' War and start from 1763, we get a good starting point. And he anticipated. He, of course, is Blake's mentor in many ways, and he is the representative of the idea that the Christian church is becoming an internal church. The idea, and I think that the idea of Jerusalem, etc., is an idea of an internal spiritual experience as opposed to the external that gives way to Blake. And that for 100, so the 7 Years' War is critical in the rise of the British Empire, because they are the ones that emerged with control of sea power, which is critical. And that period continues till 1863, and I would put that as the basis of the modern world, because there, around that period, we have the growth of the telecommunications network based on the sea routes that the British Empire had laid out, and the growth of the postal service, the International Telecommunications Union, in a planned, systematic way. Of course, the Civil War in the United States. And so 1863 to 1963 was the modern period, in my view, in the terms in which it was meant by the people that were going to control it. So that 1863 is often associated with the rise of modern arts. There's a whole range of periods. And I also have a kind of belief, to tie into your some of the eschatological debates or discussions, to look at it in a kind of spiritual history. That, remember the Pope Leo's vision of the devil and God, and the struggle for the church for 100 years. The assumption is that this was sometime in the future. I think it was referring to a period that had begun, and tying in with La Salette and some of
La Salette. Holy cow! You know, I've always thought I've read more on La Salette than anybody else in the English language. I've certainly read everything in English on it. I don't read French, but 1846.
I'm interested in this debates now. So you know better than I do, but in my little investigations into it, there's debates about prophecies and the validity of prophecies and the anticipation of what's going to happen with the church. And if you time the kind of antichrist elements to 1863, you begin to get a picture that speaks to a harmonious critique of the rise of technology as the antichrist force, which ties in with Steiner.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Steiner's analysis, the Ahrimanic thing. So when Steiner locates the fall of evil spirits to 1879, he may have been tying in with Leo on that, but it wasn't the start of the period. And the other key element in that, 1863, 1864, was when Thomas Henry Huxley set up the X Club, and the function of the X Club was to take the spirit out of scientific discourse.
Right.
And that was so. I've heard, that's the other point. I've heard you debate correctly this idea that Barfield and Steiner had about the Fourth Council of Constantinople in 869, and the idea that there the spirit was abolished. And I've looked at that as well, and I couldn't I agree with you. it's difficult to find that particular analysis or to support that. I don't think it was there. I think it was a lot more recent. I think it was deliberate scientific policy. And that also ties into the idea of progressivism is associated in particular with kind of liberal communism. But progressivism really is associated with modern scientism. So I see both critique of capitalism and of communism as based on the same source.
And this touches on one of your favorite topics, and even favorite's probably the wrong word, but most vital topics in your work and in mine too is transhumanism, right?
Yes,
and we're living in that moment right now.
Yeah, and you were onto that early on, as far as I can see, and the problem is that people. I hear people believing now with the end of the recent, or the supposed end of the recent health crisis, that the emergency, COVID and all that kind of stuff, they believe that they've kind of won some way, that they've seen through it all, and but they don't realize what game they're in. If we trace it to 1963, bearing in mind that Churchill, and that's talking about the empire of the mind in 1943. And if we look as well, Philip K. Dick's visions, for example, of that was the turning point for him. And also him going back to the St. Columbus in California in 1963. It was a lot of these arguments were over then. It wasn't starting; it was over. A lot of the fix was in. And then it was concentration on the technique, as Lowell would say, of mind control, and that's been very successful. So people are so far behind that's the great difficulty in convincing people. So transhumanism, and your instincts on that. Well, I think both your instincts are very good in relation to where the problem is and where the solution is going to come from.
Yeah, I started talking about transhumanism 20 years ago with students. And they thought I was insane. Yeah, they thought I was exaggerating.
And it is insane, but people don't understand what's insane.
It's really insane.
They don't, and perhaps the sooner they begin to focus on that, it might open up something.
And I think so. In a way, so in my work, when sociology, I've been kind of positioning it as the anti-transhumanism. It's the exact opposite of transhumanism. And part of what comes in with that is this an attentiveness to the natural world, right? I mean, a deep attentiveness. And one person I think had this kind of deep attentiveness to the deep attentiveness to the natural world was George William Russell, A.E., Irish poet. And which brings us to our topic today of the secret Commonwealth. Now, I'm gonna preface this with a story, and I have more than one story, but this is probably my favorite of the stories about the Invisible Kingdom. So, my daughter is now 20, almost 26, and so she was probably 3 years old, and we had a house in the suburbs of Detroit, and I was at school teaching. My wife was home with the kids, and she was out in the backyard raking leaves with May, my daughter, there. And May said, "Stop. Those people." And she pointed at the ground where the rake was, and she wouldn't let my wife rake anymore because she saw those people there. And that didn't surprise us. It didn't surprise us, and we didn't dismiss her as being just a fanciful child, because we grew up in a house, or she grew up in a house with no television. She didn't know about about Walt Disney or anything, So this is an organic, mystical experience for her, right?
And I'll validate that for our listeners. Just at least my oldest daughter, exactly the same thing. No TV when they were young, playing outside, building houses, and just talking to some entities, And all I felt called to do, I felt I was in the presence of the holy, and I just kind of gave her that space. But that's it for me. But it's just as a parent, we see those things if we allow our kids,
And I think, as James pointed out, right, through the from the middle of the 19th century onward, there was kind of a dual thing going on, where on the scientific side they were trying to destroy that intuition about the world, and on the other hand you had the Brothers Grimm going around collecting fairy tales. William Butler Yeats did the same thing, and then you also had the occult revival of the late 19th century and into the early 20th century, and the Celtic Twilight movement too, right? So there was you can see this push and pull that was going on at that time in history, and you would think that over time the scientism has won, but it hasn't, which is why we're speaking today.
It sure feels like it has, but go ahead. Yeah.
Well, it does.
I don't know. Yeah.
Well, sorry.
So I wonder what you could say about that, James.
If we forget the fairies and tread upon their rings, God will perchance forget us and think of other things. That was a line from Patrick McGill, who wrote in 1916, an Irish writer. And there's something in there, because the reason why William Butler Yeats became interested in what people termed the occult, but it was much wider than that, was because he said he wasn't allowed to believe in God anymore, because he perceived that this was a threat to his belief in the divine. And that's why he got particularly interested, as far as I can see. And this is the exact same motivation that drove Reverend Kirk to write or to articulate The Secret Commonwealth, because of this rise of atheism and scoffers, as they call them. So they weren't talking about people that just come to a genuine belief about there being no God, or they couldn't be convinced. They were talking about a deeper view that wanted to destroy any alternative belief, an ideological belief. And there's also the other word, which I think has cast a spell over people, is agnosticism, and the idea of being agnostic. So this word, of course, comes from Thomas Henry Huxley. So you have to be careful with that. Bear in mind, he's ideological. So people say, well, I'm agnostic, and they equate agnosticism with some kind of neutral objectivity, just waiting for the evidence. But that's not what agnosticism is, as defined by Huxley. He said that agnosticism meant that you couldn't believe in anything until it was scientifically proven, which, of course, would take out love and nearly everything, because a lot of things can't be scientifically proven. Of course, him and his friends would decide what that truth was. So agnosticism and atheism was often the reason why people began to realize that there was something to be looked at, and there was something important. In particular, as well, in Ireland, remember that when we're talking about Russell and Yeats, they're coming from a Protestant background. So they were accessing a culture that wasn't available to them in many senses because they didn't speak Irish. And this is a key factor in understanding the whole dynamic, because when we talk about English literature, or even I heard a bit of your talk, Robert Powell, on astrology. You won't find much about Irish astrology in any of the books, because it wasn't accessible to the writers in English. They would therefore look to sources that were available in the English language. But if you think about it in simple terms, that not only could the monks navigate their way by the stars from Ireland and probably come to America, but they were the ones that defended a robust view about the calculation of the date of Easter. So to not understand that they understood intensely about the stars, and that nearly every Irish saint was connected in some way with some movements in the heavens, like Bridget, etc., was linked to that. So the point that you make is important. The God comes into nearly all that, or the divine sense, not to take too narrow of a view. The idea of a higher consciousness, the idea that these beings in some way reflect a higher consciousness, or reflect our abilities to perceive them. Now, the word in Irish for the or the Gaelic language for the fairies is the she, or
she. How is that spelled, James?
There's a number of different spellings. It could be S with I and an accent on it, or Sidhe, or in Scottish terms Sith, which gives you some of the characters.
Yeah, the Sith or something. Yeah.
So Sidhe is a common Irish spelling, but then and the suggestions, if you tie it in with the Scots Gaelic, is you're getting a Sidhe with a kind of th sound at the end. So then you get into something which is equivalent to the city. So the city in the Indo-European, in the yogic tradition, the city being the fruits of the spirit that you attain through yoga practice, through attempted union with the divine. So I think the root actually, the she or the city refers to the mounds where the fairy forts were. That's one meaning, the rings that Patrick McGill talked about. It refers in another sense to the wind. There's a connection with the wind, which is obviously breath, but I think there's a deeper connection going back to the fact that Ireland was closer to Sanskrit and things than other European languages. We had a more direct route to it. So I think the she was referring as well as a reflection to the ability of the people to perceive them. So it was referring, as we see in Scotland, as Reverend Kirk talks about, we're talking about usually people with second sight or some ability to perceive them. So it wasn't available to everybody to perceive these creatures. So there may be a more reflexive relationship between the idea of the objects out there and the objects in our consciousness.
Do you think there's anything, when we talk about perception, that's also a big kind of theme. And for our viewers on YouTube, you'll see that Mike seems to have, his computer might have failed temporarily. We're sure we'll see him back. But on perception, James, you had mentioned Rudolf Steiner. The show isn't based on him. But do you think there's anything to this notion that, ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny? Michael and I both mentioned that our children, when young, seem to have these perceptual abilities, and that we kind of, at least my daughter, and I presume if Michael was still on, he'd be able to say his child who saw them, all of a sudden we lose that. Steiner would have made a connection at the human level, that in times past we had greater perceptual abilities. Now we've kind of lost them. And he puts that within a tapestry that says, it was necessary that this should happen. But on the other hand, it seems to me there's things we can do. We were talking about a certain view of church, which is just dogma, sin and moral codes versus waking up or raising perception. How do you put two of those? I believe we can be working at waking up our perception and changing, quote unquote, the musical register of the church to one of kind of sleep and waking up. At the same time, is there something, the way you see it, James, about kind of evolution of consciousness in that Steinerian sense about our ability to perceive?
Yes, definitely. We're in a period of regression, of devolution. I don't have any doubt about that the objective is for us to go back in the evolutionary chain in spiritual consciousness terms. And what I've been working on more recently is explaining what the controller's idea of is, because I believe their objective is to turn us into plants. Now that sounds strange, right? But I believe that this is what the objective is, and that's what the near 800 pages has been trying to explain. But the first thing to say is that personally, I believe that the range of beings that come within the what people call folklore. Now, I don't like the word folklore because there's an implication that it's merely a practice of storytelling, and that it's not evidence in any way, and I don't believe that to be true. Another factor associated with this, and it ties in, of course, I should have mentioned soul theology in the description or encapsulation of what work you've been doing, very conscious of that. But as you know, there's a lot of work about the nature of the alphabet, and a lot of people believe there's been a shift, as you know.
That goes to the left brain with the alphabet and everything.
Yeah, and the shift from the masculine to the feminine.
Absolutely.
but Ireland was an oral culture in many senses. So it was a very oral culture, and the story and the tradition was an oral tradition until it was recorded, in Yeats' times and that. So it was a living tradition, and people in some ways think that was a lesser piece of evidence, but they should look back on the history of Christianity, and there had to be, if you believe in that, well, there had to be part of the divine plan that was a privileging of the oral tradition, because for the first couple of generations, as we know, we didn't have the written records, because they weren't the primary modus of evidential gathering at that time, as we know, as Bauckman and people like that have talked about the origin. And people see that as a weakness. It's not. It's a testament to the perception of the superiority and primacy of the oral tradition. So Ireland had this oral tradition, which kept it alive, and that only became accessible to the intellectuals. And then they realized that when they were looking in the imperial context, they've been looking back to Greece and Rome, and that there before them was a gold mine of a culture that claimed a link back to, could have been Atlantis, deeper things, to India. It was Ireland at the time of Yeats, of course, was in the same political arrangement, was linked to India directly. They're in this the imperial structure, so that they had the close connection. And they also saw in the pre-Christian tradition a strong tradition of hospitality, a strong tradition of nobility, a strong tradition of courtesy, a strong tradition of rights. And they began to realize that there was nobility there that hadn't been available, because it had, in the imperial colonization effort for hundreds of years, it had been denied, and it wasn't available, it wasn't accepted, and it was ridiculed. They believed that the people they had to make or to reduce the people in order to conquer them. But these figures, the faeries, the Sidhe, are ontologically real. So I don't have a problem in saying that. So there's a whole range of them, and I think it's similar here. The tradition of elves and trolls that does exist. Now there is an issue about dimensionality that in my analysis, what we're doing, as it was called in the Celtic places, there's thin places, so
thin, right,
that one can move between different dimensions. There's also the point, as you said, about childhood. People haven't been trained out of the ability to perceive, and there's also the simple things about like Reverend Kirk mentions twilight, and people think, okay, twilight, well, it's just a bit, people are confused, but there is, if people want scientific evidence, that the light changes the way it perceives the world at that time. And for a short space of time, we can probably see in a different register. We can probably perceive things that are in
same thing about dawn, right? The power of dawn.
The same thing. Yes. That's why in some of the traditions, if you wanted to go and get a cure of the holy wells, you had to go out at dawn or at dusk to get them. And then, so that idea is there in the Celtic twilight. And even the idea, it was laughed at by all the contemporary poets about all the purple and the purpleness of the Celtic twilight, keeps coming purple. But if you pay attention, or one pays attention at dusk, you can begin to see, I believe, a different register of color. And in particular, there's a shade of purple that is visible when it shouldn't be. There's something about the color spectrum at that period of time. So there are other reasons where there are other elements in relation to the modus of perception that would have been more familiar to people in the past.
It's fascinating to me.
What was a real thing. But as I don't have any problem believing that they're ontologically real, and that the effort is to deny this. There's one last point on this. Why would a colonial power want to deny this? And I think if we look at Macbeth and the quote, which and wicked dreams abuse the curtained sleep. The idea that when you perpetrate some crime, if you're not a psychopath, You're not going to be able to sleep because your conscience is going to, and then you're going to see things, and then you're going to see ghosts, and then you're going to. So, apart from the psychopaths, and there was plenty of those involved in the colonial experiment, what you don't want to do, if you want your people to behead people and to kill people and to do all the awful things, is to have an idea that they can pay a price through retribution from the spirits. So it's important to deny them. It's important to take them away. And also, you've talked about the stripping of the altars. And we know that England was one of the most superstitious countries in the world before the Reformation. So we're asked to believe now, because when I talk to my English friends, if I talk about a lot of these things, some of them, they just go, their eyes glaze over, and they kind of, they're just, there's nothing there to some of my English friends, but some of the older ones, and because this has been taken out of the culture, and that's what the effort is, to cleanse the imagination of the possibilities of creativity, which I believe is what Tolkien and Barfield and Lewis was trying to do. They saw the rise of Scientocracy, and this was the antidote, as you sort of said.
Let me. I think I've got two angles of questions too. The first one, because I want to go back to orality a little bit and almost ask you to say, like, what can we do now? But let's table that for a second. But one more tableau upon which to put the loss of our able to perceive this ontological reality, and I'll use Barfield for this one, would be the notion that for Barfield, and I think this is true for Steiner, is that like the idea that the muse that was once seemed to be external and would seize the poet's mind and almost make him or her a slave, and the poet would be oracular. And then Barfield would mention how through the course of time, that muse is now located in the innermost part of the sanctuary where I am I, right? So we find this in genius. Could we say something similar happened to the position or the ontological position of these fey creatures, fairies and so forth? That could they be, everybody's listening to Joe Rogan and these people who take DMT and see these kind of gray men or whatever. Could there be a similar interiorization of this ontological reality, if that question makes sense?
Yes, I think, but when you're saying about that interiorization, are you suggesting that is a negative thing?
No. It's just, I wonder if it's just a factual thing that, like, again, if the muse was seen as outside us, and now through evolution has become kind of wedded to the innermost part of the human personality. This would be Barfield.
I was just to contextualize the question properly. My belief is that what Swedenborg said is, he said, first thing, over literalism is bad. The Bible wasn't, it has there's multiple layers, and you can't approach it too literally. Secondly, that the Last Judgment has happened, and we're moving into a different phase, and that phase was also associated with opening up of the imagination, and then we have Blake developing on that, and it was a movement away from institutions. It was a movement towards a Jerusalem which was in the imagination. So I think and I think there's prefigured, even in St. Paul, there's some statement, as far as I remember, about a Jerusalem which was free, or there's some anticipations. So what I believe the stage of spiritual evolution was an assimilation of the externalized into the internal realm, in an enrichment, an enhancement of the imagination. Now, I've used the term animosphere to describe that, to try and encompass, or to make us think in a broader sense of the totality of discourses, which, even if we go back to early Christianity, St. Patrick's prayer, and Christ be before me, Christ be behind me, it's an idea of the human as a center of a sphere of reality that's accessible through their imagination, and then not of the imaginal world in its widest sense. So and you said an important thing there in relation to I am that I am, or some similar statement.
In the innermost sanctuary of the I, like
but very important in that is that in going back to the early stages of the Israelites and the tabernacle, that the tabernacle is in us. The tabernacle has to be interiorized, so that we have the tabernacle inside us, and that the temple is inside us, so that even ultimately, I believe that there's a great chance the Catholic Church will collapse. There's another story.
This goes back to 1846, La Salette, that said, the church, and this is an approved apparition. I just want to let my Catholic listeners know this isn't a fly-by-night Mary thing.
No. So, and also, we're going to see, there's another story, but for example, if you remember the Shoes of the Fisherman with Anthony Quinn, where the Ukrainian Pope, who's been in Soviet jails, who takes over, doesn't want the reluctant Pope, and at the end, well, I don't know, spoiler alert to anyone who hasn't seen it.
I've never seen it.
I think it's 1963. Wow. Have you not seen it?
I've not seen it.
I can't really tell you then.
No, tell me.
He comes out on the balcony and he says, basically, we're giving away all the church property.
Okay, yeah.
Now, this is actually a serious possibility. This is a serious possibility that this can happen in some great, beneficent material redistribution. Oh, that's another story. We'll go back to it. But anyway, the church is the people who subscribe to it. For me, it's the people, and it's not going to die in that sense. It's going to transform, even in the worst scenarios. But so we're back to that phase, the tabernacle and the temple within. Now, how does that fit into exploration, say, with the Joe Rogan scenario? If you go through a path where you're taking these things and you're exposing yourself to beings for the fun of it, the mechanical elves and all that kind of stuff. If people want to do that, that's grand. I'm just saying, but if you think about it in a deeper sense, when you die and you're going to the next world and the mechanical elves come and say, "Oh, great that you're joining us," and you say, I didn't say I was joining you.
I was just playing around, guys.
You don't know what you're dealing with. You don't know what you're saying to those beings if you believe they're ontologically real. It's the same as the Faustian Pact. You're making an agreement with something. So if one believes that these are ontologically true and that one can venture into someone else's world without consequences, well,
that's a very good warning. I agree with you 100% on that.
And the key thing, the key difference, and here's the difference. And I believe, one, I'll call it a belief or perception. I won't even put it higher than that, just for the not to make too high claims, but I'd put it in a different way in another context. But my belief is that these beings, which are ontologically real, some of the fairies look like greys, and I also think that they can move into human space, that their form can move into humans. Okay. That the nature of their composition is like holographic or like a collection of ions, and that it's capable that they can pass into the human energy field. I believe the same thing about these things. Now, the key point in this is one of the things that's incredibly forgotten about in Christianity is that a dominant aspect of Christianity was the power over evil spirits. It was a central aspect, and maybe one of the highest aspects. And the irony is that a lot of the people that engage in dark magic, in black magic, in sorcery, seek to utilize Christianity and saints to protect them so that they can gain power. So at the same time, people who are supposedly committed to Christianity kind of don't believe in them, even though their adversaries believe in the power of Jesus and of the saints and of Saint Michael in particular. So it's very, very odd. So they do it.
I like your sense of shock still and wonder. I agree. It still shocks you that people.
Yeah, because they don't understand what they're dealing with. They don't believe that sorcery and magic is real, or spell casting, or that people want to do evil. They don't believe that. Now, why that? Okay, but I do. And so if you have nothing inside you, if you haven't, I won't say avatar, but if you haven't integrated one of the higher, whether you're Buddhist or you believe in the Pure Land Buddhism, or you're Muslim, or you're Christian, if you haven't sought to integrate into yourself a higher being, you're an open parking lot to be haunted by anything. That's
now let's say more a little about that. Like, as a spiritual practice, this notion of integrating a higher being, bringing it back down to earth a little bit. What do you like your personal path? Does it mean, like, say, really dialing on Saint Michael or Saint Francis of Assisi, or is it kind of prayer to the saints in general at different times? We might pray to Saint Jude or Saint Patrick. Say a little bit more about how you see that taking place, because you're making a very concrete case, almost a provable one, that unless we kind of fill ourselves with the good, we're an open vessel for the bad. Can you say a little bit? Can you say a little bit more about, like, the practice as you see it, or as it's worked in your life?
For me personally, I was quite cosmopolitan. I was brought up Catholic, but I had great problems with witnessing before me, the usual story. Sure. People not practicing what they preach and all that kind of stuff. But I read a lot of history and that, so I never got into a stupid idea of rewriting the history. I have respect for the historical sources, and I don't make an oversimplistic critique, and I often end up defending the historical church because people are just wrong in relation. Because now we have a lot of people saying, for example, that Christianity began only 1,000 years ago. I can't stand it. I just find so. And then I have problems now in relation to what's happening in the church, and I also have another. I haven't got this book out yet, but it's about Trotskyism and Gramsci and all that kind of stuff. Now, if one understands what has been happening for the last 100 years, one has to be very careful in dealing with institutions. So certainly, I think you can get inspiration from a range of traditions. I've always felt that, but there's higher level traditions in it, and for me, the Saint Michael figure became important very big in my awakening, and that's there for Steiner. I did have, so again, I don't want to get into a position where a person gets into all the unique things that only happen to them, and it begins to sound like self-aggrandizement. But I did have a kind of a little epiphany, and one of a whole range of epiphanies, which corresponded with Michaelmas as well. And I said, okay, there's some context when I wasn't really aware of it at that time. Although I would have been, because if you're from a legal term and university term and going back to Michaelmas was always important. But so on Saint Michael's feast, there was a kind of a realization that I associated with Michael, and I began to look again at this figure of Michael. And again, for some people it's Saint Michael, for some people it's the Archangel Michael, for some people it's just Michael. This figure is very, very important, and it's important as the oppositional force, as we know, towards the Ahrimanic force. Now, I would have come to that independently on my own view, independent of, say, Steiner. On that.
This was more visceral for you. You're saying you would have come to it like by reading the Sophiologists and.
I would have come to it as well by my I don't want to experiences, intuitive inspiration, or whatever you want to call it, without over describing it. But they would have, in the sense you talk about the muse. What happened for me that made me look back at spirituality was that I began to find ready-made answers, lines, things that I didn't seem to work at. Now I understand the description left brain, right brain, how it comes and how that works. I understand that. But it was the effortlessness of conclusion or perception. And there's also a noetic feel about certain lines, statements, insights that become clear. And for example, recently I've been thinking about Bridget. This is the Bridget's cross behind the study for Bridget.
Is that your own painting?
Yeah, it's
okay.
It's a
I like
study
it.
for
Saint Bridget. The Mary of the Gales, right?
Yeah, but so Saint Bridget's an interesting figure, and there's loads of interesting debates. But she was a pagan figure and a Christian figure. So some people say, "Oh, the Christian figure never existed." Again, those debates don't interest me. But this is a very, very, a very important figure. She may be the most important figure in the sociological or the new sociological canon. She may be one of them. I would emphasize her, and why I would emphasize her was. Are you familiar with the notion of the bridewell or bridewell, like a prison where you would have come across, you'll come across it somewhere. Okay. In a lot of police stations, they have a bridewell or a holding station. They're all around the world.
Yeah.
And the bridewell goes back to St. Bride's Well in the city of London. So St. Bride's Well was a holy place associated with Bride, who was Bridget.
Okay.
So Bride is what the English call Bridget. So it was an important place in London. And the Bridewell, that was a holy place, turned into the Bridewell prison. It was one of these, a changeling, which is another idea associated with faeries.
Sure.
This was an inversion.
Like a free flowing became a jail, like an upward going well, free fluid becomes a concrete masculine type of locking on, almost blocking the well, right?
Not only that, this was exactly the spot where Henry VIII was when the Reformation happened.
Fascinating.
It came from there. And after that, so we had Saint Bride, Bridget, transformation, arrival, the Virgin Queen, his daughter, Queen Elizabeth, this appropriation. This is the changeling. It's a strategy. It's an inversion. So and again, if you follow that little stream, or the River Fleet that flows into the Bridewell, it's just off the Thames, you get to Clerkenwell, where the Bolsheviks were formed. The Bolsheviks were formed in London up that river. It's quite it's another story, but it's quite remarkable. It's in all Dickens' story where all the prisons were. You'll recognize all the places. It was on the River Fleet. And Bridewell was there. So, but the funny thing is that the Normans were always afraid of the Celtic saints, and this is an empowering thing. They had, and I've seen this in some of the academic literature. You don't see much. They were afraid and fearful of the power of the Irish and Celtic saints.
Say more. Like in what way? You're like in a visceral way. It's just
It seemed a deep fear, and I think that was why it took a while to get rid of them. And the Reformation as well may have contributed to that. They believed that they had power because they did have power. I have to develop this point. But notice when Prince Charles becomes King Charles and the coronation, he's still going to have, I think, the Stone of Destiny under the throne, which the Stone of Destiny is quite remarkable. Which now there's a lot of debates about that. We could have there's another discussion on that, but it goes back to the Tuatha Danann originally in the legend of that stone. Now, this particular stone doesn't, but it goes back to an ancient stone of the Tuatha Danann, who were the people that the faeries supposedly came from.
So, that's all new to me. Gotcha.
Yeah. But they believe in these things. That's why they went after the witches, because they believed these things were powerful. That's why James I persecuted the witches, because they knew that there was a power there. Now, so it wasn't solely an anti-women thing. There was males killed in the witch thing as well. Of course, there was misogyny involved in that, but it was also because they feared them. And this is an interesting point that people don't understand. That early, and in particular the Celtic Church, they had power. Can I make one more point? I don't want to
absolutely.
And this is important for anyone that wants to understand the reality, and it's not there in the literature. uh, 536 is a key year. Now I know you talked with a priest who mentioned 572 as the fall, associated with the fall of the Roman Empire.
Mm-hmm.
536 was the key year that changed the world. Civilizations fell. Mexico, the civilization fell. The Roman Empire fell. Circumstances changed dramatically up here.
Are you saying Teotihuacan fell? Is that the Mexican civilization?
No, it's I think it's the one beginning with O fell. It's
okay,
major,
the Olmec. Maybe?
I'm not sure if it was the Olmec.
Okay, I'm ignorant on it. Go ahead.
It was the dominant one.
Yep. Okay.
I don't want to state.
Me neither.
I don't remember the particular thing, but it was a major transformation. Now, it's scientists are quite convinced that the Icelandic volcanoes went off, a volcano probably in America, and probably Krakatoa. So they erupted in 536, and they caused darkness, and that's where the Dark Ages came from.
Mm-hmm.
It was literal darkness. So recently, the oldest rune, there's a new book out about the oldest rune stone in Sweden. Now this is near, funnily enough, where Swedenborg would have spent time.
Okay.
There's another connection, but the oldest rune stone. So usually they say James Tunney is here. He was a great man, and whatever, he died, and whatever. So this one said, according to this new interpretation, and so the dating of the runes are about 800, and it says 9 generations ago the wolf ate the sun. That more or less, that's what it says. So now they're realizing that referred to 536.
The volcanoes and the darkness that descended.
And it's up. And here is where you get the basis of a lot of Norse mythology. A lot of it came from this cataclysm. So how 536 was critical in the Irish context was, out of that we have Columba. So Columba comes to Iona, and he sets up really the heart of the Celtic Christian world, from which we get subsequently the Book of Kells, the great efflorescence, as well as that a Bible which is not just in words, it's pictures as well.
Right
so
brain and left brain.
Yeah. Defies the idea about what the alphabet and how dangerous that was. So we get now who. And this is the key point that a lot of people don't understand, because they say, well, the Celtic, the church came in, destroyed all this, and now they're saying that Columba was a colonizer, all this nonsense, absolute, utter nonsense. But what happened, in my view, and I'm fairly convinced about this, other people wouldn't agree with it. Someone, a person I've seen making a comment, they didn't say why they didn't agree with it, but they said it had been studying for 40 years, but there was no specific critique. And funnily enough, I contacted one of the scientists who has worked on this dating 536. It's corroborated by looking at tree rings, dendrochronology, and also glaciers. So there's no doubt in my head. Although funnily enough, the scientists I talked said, yes, that date was important, it was critical, but I don't think there was anyone called Saint Columba.
Yeah, that's why we always have to work on two fronts, right?
Well, it was kind of frightening. But anyway, so here what did that mean for the Druids? It meant that their magic and maintaining order and maintaining the logos didn't work. For a number of years, the crops failed, the people died, they couldn't see the sun. So that's where we had this transformation. So I believe that Columba, and that would have come from a druidic context, where they said, okay, this magic is missing something, and therefore they embraced Christianity in a way that was a synthesis, because Columba never gave away any of his powers. He communicated with shining beings. He communicated with with beings that sound extraterrestrial. He could see at second sight. He could see at a distance. He could do remote viewing. He could do the whole lot of it. He was the first person. I probably mentioned the Loch Ness Monster. It's quite remarkable. So he didn't give up any of those spiritual. They weren't inconsistent with Christianity. He integrated Christianity into the pre-existing.
He didn't give up any of those spiritual powers, right?
No.
I get it.
Or beliefs. Or they integrate. And that's why the Celtic cross has the sun and the cross in unity, with a circle and the cross. It's showing that they're harmonious. They link together. The Son of God, the sun, literally bring the sun back. And this also corresponded with Newgrange, which is 5,000 years old in Ireland, that it was built so the sun shines in on the 21st of December. So every year still, the sun shines in through a chamber over the doorway into the center of this mound. And that was built 5,000 years ago. The sunlight, 21st of December, it's a bit of a giveaway, you know. So there was, it was easy to marry those views. So the critics that say that Christianity came in and destroyed, it's not true. It was the other way around, that they moved in, and that's why it was so successful, because they loved nature. That's why you have St. Kevin, St. Bridget, Brendan, and also
ladies and gentlemen, Michael Martin has returned, gone for a full 25-minute break with a power outage or something. Yeah. You haven't missed anything, Michael. Just kidding. You've missed a lot.
I know.
We're talking about the the power of the Celtic saints, St. Columba, St. Bridget, and how at that early Celtic Christian point, they didn't renounce their powers when they.
And not only that, if you look at the Adam Naun, who wrote the life of Columba, who also wrote the vision of Adam Naun is meant to be an anticipation of Dante. And Adam Naun also wrote, although he hadn't been there, a description of the features of that. It was the first tourist guide, if you like, or pilgrimage guide to Jerusalem and the Holy Land, because of his conversations with people who had been there. So, and also we get this idea of Jerusalem as a place. And Jerusalem is an imaginary place as well that was reflected in the monasteries. So it becomes a place which is where Blake later brings it on. But if the monks, as it seems, possibly went to America, definitely went to Iceland, definitely it's been proven now, I think, recently in scientific papers, were in the Faroe Islands before the Vikings. Why did they do all these things? Well, one, they were very adventurous. They were very brave. They were very aware of the stars. The Celtic cross, for some people, is an indication of a navigational device. It reflects this device they used for sailing. So they're obviously very brave. And if they were bringing God's word to the end of the earth, they saw that there was something coming from the north. They knew there was something, so they had to go to the end of the earth. They did go to the ends of the earth. So it was a much more robust exploratory institution. Last point, sorry for banging on so long, but last point. When we come then to the expansion of the British Empire, John Dee all of a sudden, John Dee discovers, or he has the plans for the expansion of the British Empire. There's a magical ceremony to initiate the British Empire, and directs the people to go to North America. How did he know about North America? He probably knew it is the biggest library in the world, in Britain certainly. Where did the library come from? It came from the monasteries. Why did the monasteries tell them? They had information about the stars, about navigation, and that's where a lot of the secrets came from as well in the Reformation. Sorry for going on. So
no. I follow it. And to bring Michael up to speed, James has taken us through a tour de force. But one was. But what we're talking about is a big theme in our show, is that the historical atrophying of the imaginative, the feminine. The wells go dry. We're talking about the blocking up of wells, and so we have this huge theme, and we have again tied into the realm of fairies, is this inability to perceive and so forth. But I want to ask you, James, I know Michael will have a lot of thoughts on this too. So here we are, and you had mentioned the alphabet, and I mentioned I wanted to revisit orality and so forth. There's a great scholar I'm reading now, and I've got 2 more books on the way. And I don't know if you've heard of him, James. His name is Marcel Jousse, Jousse. He was a Jesuit, a precursor to Walter Ong, a precursor to Havelock and so forth, but maybe this foundational scholar of orality. He grew up in the Sarthe region of France and really grew up in an oral culture with the peasants, talking. But I'm really going into him because, the Catholic Church has had this kind of, there's a crisis in the church. So the bishops get together and they say in the US, 3 years of indoctrination on the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, right? And it seems to lack all poetry. And so I'm even looking at the ritual of the Eucharist, which precedes literacy, the roots of it in oral culture, this Marcel Jousse wrote about. That being said, especially as pertaining to the alphabet, and I know Michael was reading a book, A is for Ox, by Barry Sanders, or was it the
ABC?
Okay, because he has another one called A is for Ox too. What would you do? We're stuck with some form of literacy, but what would you say, James, is a way to guide us to a raising of perception? What are some practical things we can do to fight on our own, to fight the final last remnants of our quote unquote right brain being atrophied, to almost near sclerosis?
I should have, or to tie into the question you asked me beforehand about practices. And to tie in to Michael missed it, of course, a key theme is about sophiology. And what I was suggesting is that Bridget, whether you conceive her as a pagan or whether you conceive her as a Christian saint.
Michael, you'll be glad to know Bridget and St. Michael are looming super large here.
That's my team right there.
That's your team, yeah.
So when when my African American friend looked at this, and I started to explain to him what this cross was, and he said, "Oh, I know, it's a sun symbol," and that's correct as well, and this association with the sun is one reading of it. But then when you get into that, then a wheel of light, there's also association with the chakras. Mm-hmm. I believe that Bridget is a very strong candidate for a representation of the anima in us.
Yeah.
That it's in us. So Kundalini, all this kind of stuff, I'm not talking about that particular, but when you take them into your system, embodied them in a real imaginative way, they become a literal positive force in your body, and they begin to explain things associated with, even in terms of health, but in the way, the movement of things, the flow, etc. So I believe that I've sought to define the animosphere in particular to anticipate that sophiological element, that it has to be the feminine element. That's what has been fought against. We know that, but there's 2 elements in that. There's a danger in that as well. And let me give you another example. And this is where the logic of the fairies or the story of the fairies is important, because the key idea is the changeling. Now, I associate the changeling with the inversion.
Right.
You get something that kind of looks like what was there before, but it's not it. Now, the example I would use, it's also important to understand the depths of this spiritual warfare on the individual. For example, when I was in Dublin, as a student, I think I was a student at that time, but it was about the time when Ireland was going through a great transformation, the end of the kind of widespread Catholic belief in a deeper sense, and we got MTV. MTV came in always. Now, for me, I was just amazed at this cultural imposition. It was kind of a shock in relation to it was just if you're aware of things, you're aware that this is like a battering ram. No, I'm not prudish or anything. I'm not threatened by them. I'm open to a lot of things, but you're aware that there's something going on here. And associated with that period, when you're beginning to see, you had Madonna, a very, very interesting cultural thing which is underexplored. So here we're in a culture which sees as a very strong image of the Virgin Mary, Madonna. All of a sudden, you get a great constant force of Madonna, a pop icon, capturing the attention, like a virgin, Madonna, like a virgin, a feminine archetype as a dominatrix, Madonna, 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 and in the end, you get the changeling, you get the what's left over. It really is a cultural program, and people may think that's too easy. And you also had the main foreign airline coming into Ireland was Virgin. So you had a changeling come in. You had in the public consciousness, there was a shift. And people say, well, that doesn't work. It does work. And substitution, I've described it in my book, it's a substitution loop. You have a loop of the Virgin Mary associated with the Holy, and then you replace it with another thing. And people don't believe in this. So what you have is, you have the feminine logos replaced by a changeling commercial logo.
Yeah.
It's that simple and it's that profound, and people haven't seen it. So that in some ways, the fairy stories anticipate some of how dark forces behave. There's that element. By looking at some of the stories, you can begin to see the king of the Black Desert. You can begin to see anticipates Gawain and the Green Knight. Why are they telling us these stories?
Really interesting that these fairy stories anticipate. I'm just reiterating what you said. The fairy stories anticipate some of these templates used in our time, so we can help recognize what's going on.
Yeah, they don't, and that's not an accident. All that stuff is not an accident. And also, I wrote a book. I say about a very select group of people. It was a novel. It was called Blue Lies September. It's in many ways it's super flawed in some senses, but I'm very happy with what I did in it. It was about, the main character was a dominatrix. I was trying to represent this figure that had come into public. I'm fascinated with, why is this figure here? And this is the figure. This is the changeling faux representation of the strong feminine. That's what it is.
And that's
it's being used as a false goddess, and goddess. I mean, it's quite remarkable. And in that book, I anticipated, for example, for a different reason, I anticipated lockdowns. I anticipated London being locked down. I could see it happening. I anticipated a number of things I could feel that. So I'm happy that I did that before this.
Absolutely documented.
So these figures, the pagan Christian with Christian figure of Bridget. If you're a Christian, the archetype of Bridget is a figure that represents your internal. It's a figure that informs the tabernacle or the carrying of the tabernacle around. It gives you a modus to operate. It gives you an inspiration, the proper sense of what the word inspiration is. So I think what Blake is, what Swedenborg is saying, what Blake is saying, and what this movement in the next generation, the interiorization, is the building up, recognizing where we've gone wrong, as Barfield have talking about, and the recovery, as Tolkien anticipated, the recovery as Lewis anticipated. The opposition is the machine, as Tolkien said, the machine that is going to take our soul, and literally, I believe we're talking about the end of the human race and the end of the human spirit. I don't mind losing my life, but I don't want to lose my eternal soul. That's the difference. I've no problem. I mean,
point taken.
But there's a difference. If you believe in your eternal soul, you don't want to give it up to in a Faustian pact. And this is what the machine is doing.
Yeah.
The solution that they're pointing to, and that I see in parallels to yours, that in the conviviality and in the sophiology, is to reanimate our consciousness by reference to the proper archetypes, the positive archetypes, which are not false changeling substitutes.
And I think you make an important point where you're talking about the changelings, right? Is that's what transhumanism is. It's creating a nation, a genus of changelings.
Yes.
It looks human, but it's not human. It's the same thing with GMO agricultural products and even animals, right? They may look, I tell my students, well, it might look like corn. Is it really corn? If it has spider DNA in it or other things. And, I don't know if you're familiar with this. One of the original people at Findhorn, R. Ogilvy Crombie. Do you know about him?
It rings a bell.
He writes.
He
he was a person who had. He was I think he was a physicist by training, but he was intuitive and had communication with nature spirits, including the great god Pan.
Yes, I do know him. Yeah, he lived in Edinburgh.
And
he might have been a lawyer. Was he?
That's the guy. He was a physicist, I think. He was a scientist.
Yeah. But he lived in Edinburgh.
And his experience with Pan, Pan told him, "I serve the Almighty God." But he also warned him, but there's also an anti-Pan. So there's somebody out there imitating me who's not me and who's not good, right? Which is the same thing we have with Philip K. Dick and all the androids, right? And his fundamental insight about how do you know who you are, right? How do you know you're real? How do you know you're not a robot?
Yeah.
Right.
And don't you think we've barely begun to catechize people in the sense that the Antichrist or Lucifer, again, is so similar looking to Christ? We have this whole world deluded that evil is 180 degrees away from good, not the close corruption of good and so forth.
Right.
Yes, and this is where the discernment comes in. It's at the margin, because you can agree with them for 98% of the important things that they say, but it might be the 2% which is the hinge issue, is the key bit. So they only have to sell you. They sell you a certain amount, and they know, and they're very good at selling this. But it's what is the key, the marginal bits, and this is where the fairy thing is. It's all on the margin. It's all in that bit that we're talking about, on the cusp. Mm-hmm.
It's on the cusp.
It's in the gap. It's on the foreshore between the land and the sea. It's in the threshold on the liminal zone. It's about being able to negotiate that and you only negotiate that by having, in the Sufi context, orientation. You have to have that commitment to the highest of what is the highest for you, right. And whether it be Michael or whatever. And there's another thing about this. The doppelganger is a key issue as well, which is associated with the changing and the two things. And this was a very common thing. I remember my grandfather, who also, claimed to see the banshee and or hear the banshee or see her sitting up on a post combing her hair. And also he did have this experience of the fetch of the person appearing when they couldn't have possibly appeared, when they were in England and they had died. And this is a common thing. And this is what in the book The Secret Commonwealth by Pullman, he developed that doppelganger aspect. There's an interesting bit about that as well. It's about, if you look at Stephen King or Pullman, a lot of these people, and I'm not saying anything bad against, but a lot of these people don't actually believe in these as ontological things, and they don't. A lot of them, I don't want to talk about particular individuals, but they're atheists. They don't believe in higher spiritual stuff. So even in these contexts, there's a difference between reading Reverend Kirk, who believes in a whole range of things and believes in a divine consciousness, and reading someone who doesn't believe in higher things and is merely interested in the sensations of them.
Right.
And there's another, and this is going to be another big problem in relation to what you said, Michael, about the transhumanism. A lot of scientists believe that highly sophisticated technological cultures will be invisible. The beings will be invisible. So there is another idea that, there's certainly the idea that we have creatures on this planet that are plasmate form or a different form of matter that science hasn't really copped onto or hasn't been looking for that. And Helen Sharman, who was the first British astronaut, said that she believed that was possibly the case. And then we have the idea that there's possibly other machine beings that don't seem to be machines because they seem kind of spiritual. This is going to be a problem, combined with the technology that they have to confuse us, and as they sought to use during Cuba, as project Jesus into the clouds and all that kind of stuff, a hologram. It's going to be very, very difficult for us to distinguish between what's real, ontologically real, and what's not, although we might think it's benign. So all those issues come back, and the only way we can judge them is by having some kind of a priori sense of what is truthful and what is important in this.
And I think there are certainly, like my daughter, for instance, but there are people who are kind of have a natural gift for seeing these things, right? Where other people don't, which is, and I think the bad guys know about it, because my wife was telling my kids, they were asking about MK Ultra. And my wife said, yeah, those are the kind of people that, if they'd known about how your dad was when he was a kid, they would have kidnapped him and put him into a place trying to do remote viewing. Because like you said with your grandfather and the stories of the Banshee, my grandfather was from Carrick on Shannon in Ireland.
Okay, yeah.
And he told us the same story, same stories from and that, for those of you who don't know, that's out. I don't know if it still is, but it was when I was there 30 years ago, way out in the countryside.
Yeah, it's not far from where our family was historically. And again, going back to, it's near the Columba territory that we were talking about.
Yeah,
and they were very open to it. Yes, there's also a strong idea, as we know, in the literature, that the mystical community is hidden, and that the idea of the congregation of light, for example, the idea that the mystics are there, they don't necessarily have to be open. And there's a lot to be said for that, because, as you said, if they know where you live, they might be knocking on your door.
Yeah.
And now the mystics, here's the key point. We're at the stage, we've kind of, I don't know, we're just at the intersection, but we're there somewhere, there or thereabout. The stream has started going two different ways already. And the problem will be here now. We have the conflict with Saint Columba, Saint Patrick, with Bridget. They could demonstrate their power. This is how Christianity grew. They could demonstrate their awareness of natural magic and divine light magic, which at various stages was acceptable to the church. Not talking about ceremonial magic, but the idea of understanding the magic in nature or the immanent divine, and the idea of understanding higher order inspiration. So they could demonstrate their power. They could show by example. Now, the current priesthood doesn't have the magic.
Greatest understatement in the history of the Regeneration podcast.
But I mean, it's a big problem. They can't lead. They can't oppose. They can only probably contribute towards the forces of globalization, whatever you want to call it, the forces towards global government. They don't have the ability. They don't even have the ability to analyze it. They don't have the ability to understand whether they're being deceived, even if they're not badly intentioned. So this is a great problem. So here is the issue. If the mystics cannot demonstrate their power, in evolutionary terms, it kind of fails. It wasn't. It wasn't. There's something inherent in that failure. It's testament to its. It has to demonstrate its power. It can't hide itself away. And one point, when I tying in with the sophiology and tying in with what people actually believed, when I began to talk to some of my relations, there's one of my aunts who's still alive in London, and she's intensely religious. Now, Irish spirituality had nothing doctrinal in it. There was nothing. It wasn't anything about rituals, regulations, or rules, or about doctrine. They weren't interested in any of that. It was a deep spirituality that it didn't even. There was no argument in it. It was a force. Yeah. And this is may the force be with you. it was of that level of a real presence, a real presence.
Young people are hungry for that, by the way. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and so I was talking to her about her belief a few times, to try and get a sense of what was the important thing for her and her mother, who had a similar, almost a natural force belief. It wasn't anything, there was nothing in it. And for them, the key figure was the Holy Spirit. Now, this doesn't appear in the discussions about Irish Catholicism, but it seems, now I don't know how deep or widespread this is, but the figure that spoke to them was the Holy Spirit.
Mm-hmm.
That was, so it was more consistent with, if you like, the Great Spirit in the Native American traditions. It was a lot more comprehensive.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't got to do with any of the particular saints. And that was a real force that was of real use. And it was as real as anything. It was as real ontologically as anything. And that's not really, it doesn't come up in that form when you look at all the kind of concretized left brain descriptions of what was going on.
So in our house church services, we often read from the Carmina Gadelica, which is, and the prayers and songs and poetry in there, they're so connected to, they connect Christ and the Holy Spirit and God the Father and the Virgin and Saint Bridget, and they're big on Saint Michael all the time.
Yeah.
To nature, it's all intertwined with nature, and it's interesting that Celtic spirituality, unlike everything else in Western European Catholicism, was not an urban phenomenon. It was out in the wastes, in the wild,
mm-hmm.
right? It was not a city thing.
This is an important point. Ireland didn't have cities, so Ireland, the population was spread out, was decentralized, and that was very important because it led to a different type of economy. Sometimes the anarcho-capitalists look back to ancient Ireland, whether it was right or not. They had the Brehon law legal system, which was a sophisticated legal system well before the common law ever happened. They had, for example, Adam Naun, who came on from Columba, created an international conference in Ireland in the 8th century to promulgate the first, if possibly the first ever international convention for the protection of the rights of women and children in the event of warfare. It's the oldest example of an international legal convention for that particular reason. So law and jurisprudence, this is the thing that's ignored in all the debates. If you look at Muhammad and Islam, we're talking about jurisprudence. If you look at a lot of the great Islamic writers, we're talking about jurisprudence, about the science and study of law. If we look at Moses, we're talking about jurisprudence. So law, rules, and religious behavior, the law and the natural law sense, is important, but it's also a more integrated thing. Now, there's also another poem from the 8th century. I don't remember the exact detail, but it kind of ties into the St. Patrick's prayer and that idea of the ubiquitous, immanent divine in a lament way, where Lady Gregory's translation, and they use this in the film The Dead by John Huston, based on James Joyce's short story, where he says, the poem says, "You have taken the east from me, you have taken the west, you have taken, so you've taken everything from," and the final line is, "And my greatest fear is you have taken God from me." Now that's a frightening line.
I didn't realize that what that was from. It's beautiful.
Yeah. So that was it was in the Dead film. It was a translation from Lady Gregory of an 8th century Irish poem. So the implication of all this, that this is what the game is. It's not to take your Bitcoin. It's not to take your wealth. It's to take God and your soul from you. That's what the game is in all this. And there's no other. If anyone thinks it's lesser than that, they're mistaken on that. So we're in the period where we're fighting for not just the human race, and I mean in a peaceful sense, of course, but the struggle is for the continuation of the human spirit in any meaningful sense.
Well,
and as we kind of go ahead.
I'm sure you know this, that 100 years ago, Rudolf Steiner predicted that that a vaccine would eventually be developed that would destroy the relationship of the body to the soul.
October 1917, he did that. I think it was around that time he did it.
Yeah, I think so.
So, and notice the time as well, 1917, Fatima, Bolsheviks. I mean, it was clear going on. I don't think you were here when I was saying. I think the period was I don't know where 1863 to 1963. So that was a turning point as well in that movement towards ubiquitous materialism, permanent kind of unavoidable materialism, and also a bloody materialism. Now, my final point in the book that I wrote recently, I trace a lot of this to France. I trace a lot of it to Norman France, that the basis of there's this idea of a centralized church, which doesn't actually, when you look at the historical evidence, it was never really as centralized as people claim. So therefore, the attribution towards a centralized order in Rome, it just doesn't stand up to historical scrutiny. Whereas if you look at the origin of a lot of matters, crusades, for example, they're really essentially associated with the French nobility. And if you look at the destruction of the Cathars and that, it's really associated with the Templars. It's associated with the French nobility. And the French nobility were also, there's a very interesting PhD written on, I think it's Philip the Good, I got them mixed up, Philip the Good, Philip the Bold, and he set up the Order of the Golden Tree, which is as far as I can see, it's really the model network where you give gifts to people without holding a particular state, and you get their allegiance in the context of political shenanigans, and really from there, translated into the British Empire. We have.
Isn't that what they're talking about now with philanthrocapitalism? This latest Bitcoin or this crypto scandal. You know, these people just say, "I'm going to get so rich so I can start giving money," and they actually pose as good, benevolent people. You know, and not as these people are trying to engineer a whole new human being. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I don't. I did say, I was saying I did a couple of interviews with younger people that were interested in younger than me anyway, interested in Bitcoin, and they kind of look down the nose a bit when I say, well, look, I think you have to accept when you're talking about these things that value can go to zero, and they kind of think that I don't really get the technology and all this. I don't, and you have to understand about Ponzi schemes and all that kind of stuff. But they think I just don't get it. I saw the same thing when they had the Celtic tiger. I knew the Celtic tiger was doomed to extinction. Tiger has nothing got to do with Celtic.
That was a hard thing to watch for all of us who love Ireland so much.
I was out of Ireland, but I couldn't believe it, because if they had any sense, they would have seen what had happened with the Asian tigers.
Yeah.
Before that, and Soros and all.
Vulture capitalism, right?
Yeah, and just check my battery here as I'm talking to you. And people were advising me then. They were telling me that, they were giving me lectures. Young people giving me lectures about economics, and it was cool. It was absolute.
Well, how about this? As we wind down a little bit, James, you know, I want to highlight some things. Is that you began with what I consider this kind of tour de force, and Michael, when your power went out and so forth, or your internet, James continued to just draw on like previous episodes and things, and I just the courtesy, you know, of you kind of investigating us and so forth. But you know, the larger theme is how much we are working on the same thing from different angles. So it's been such a joy. You know, I wonder, James, if you know, A, we'd like to have you on again for sure, and B, absolutely. Can you tell people how to locate more of your work? You know, direct us and do a commercial for yourself, and don't rush it.
The only thing I'd say is have a look at the Plantation of the Automatons, which is probably the most serious work I've done. I put that out this week. The Plantation of the Automatons.
I'm writing that down too.
That's the main thing at the moment. I've worked hard on that. I'd rather be doing other things. I have a stack of books that I wanted to do, but this one was forcing its way forward. And I think I don't want to praise myself on that, but because of the things I've studied that you don't know in your lifetime when you study things, what becomes important. But when you're going on a spiral, some of the things that didn't seem important become important. For example, the legal history of Europe is not a thing that I hear in most of these debates. But to give one example, for example, Marxism, according to people like Professor Alan McFarlane, got their analysis wrong because they didn't understand the legal history of Britain when they were doing their analysis. And that's right. And to understand what has happened and what's happening, you really have to come back to some of these historical issues. So I've sought to do that. And a lot of people won't find it an easy read. It is complex. You don't like complex books, don't bother. But for anyone that's it's too difficult, no problem. But if you're looking to try and join some of the deeper dots, there are answers in there. And the one point I would make is that I've tried to describe what's happening in the spiritual sense. There is what I call a mystic murmuration happening. There is a counter force which is gathering in form.
Mystic murmuration, I like that.
Yeah, it's whether it's you want to call it the Great Spirit, the Holy Spirit, whatever tradition people come from, and also associate with that. Dr. Zelenko in the United States said, well, I'm Jewish, but my family don't support me recently in relation to decisions I've made about what I think is going on. And now I feel that I'm brother to anyone in the spiritual traditions that understand what's happening. And funny enough, when I was looking back at who predicted this, if you look back at Cardinal Fulton Sheen, he said in the future.
From Rochester, New York, where I reside.
He said, interesting, I was kind of looking back because I've written about automaticity. He said that the world will become automatic and that every spiritual tradition will have to unite to fight it. Anyone that believes in the spirit. He said it in one of the things. And
it's a beautiful image.
Yeah.
And that's also a theme. That's a theme of Vladimir Solovyev's short story of the Antichrist.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, great. And I'm finding a lot back in the. So the what I'd say to you gentlemen is that your work is very enriching. You've got a lot of information about what seem to be niche points for some people, but they're critical, and you're exploring them and joining them. And I think you've also been open-minded and undogmatic in your presentation, which is very, very important. And it's the sign of it doesn't mean that we won't be able to get something which shines true concrete in the end, but in the exploratory phase it has to be open. And Donella Meadows, who was the kind of one of the key theorists behind the Council of Rome, and from the other side, if you like, she identified the key factors in changing society, and the ultimate factor, the most important, the number one factor, and this is from their perspective, is going, not only changing the paradigm, but going beyond the paradigm. And that takes a certain type of mind. You have to be disciplined. Discipline is very important from wherever you get that, whether you're a lawyer or a scientist, or whether you study literature or whatever way. You need some discipline, and you need then for that to inform the right brain. And from that, we can employ a full spiritual consciousness to get to an answer. So I know from the topics you're looking at that these are getting very warm.
That's the project. Yeah.
Well, that's very, very, very flattering, James. I can't thank you enough for being on the Regeneration podcast. How about we have you on another time to talk about plantation of the automatons?
Right. I hope for the people that were listening to the fairies that we didn't go off on a tangent too much. The fairies on that.
I think it was all great. And Michael, we missed you for that time. We were running you down a lot, Michael, during that time. So please,
I'm sure.
Please don't listen. All right. Thanks, James. And thanks everybody for listening to the Regeneration podcast.
Thanks,
God
Michael.
bless. Yeah.